Not every photographer is an artist. Art has been cancelled. Richard F. Adams. This essay is one of three. It's a purist view of art. The next one is about art education, and the third one is about democratization of tools, and how glorious that is. We've reached one of those oddly well-meaning cultural moments where nobody is allowed to be merely competent. Everyone is creative, everyone is a maker, everyone, apparently, is an artist. The result is not a great flowering of culture, but a quiet collapse of standards. The average is now the leading edge, and the work is increasingly ephemeral. Future historians will find only naive amateur work, while cutting-edge stuff by the likes of Banksy will have disappeared totally, leaving only neuronic traces in the alien minds of our future AI overloads. The word artist has been stretched so far it now covers everything from serious formal invention to someone pointing an iPhone at a coffee cup and feeling vaguely profound about it. That isn't democracy, it's inflation. And like economic inflation, it quietly devalues the real thing. So let's say the unfashionable bit out loud. Most photographers are not artists. Some are, obviously, but most are not. Most are skilled practitioners, technicians, stylists, people who know how to handle light, timing, exposure, composition, editing, atmosphere, and that peculiar bit of alchemy, where a moment becomes an image. None of that is trivial, and in fact, done well, it's impressive. But it still isn't necessarily art in its fullest sense, and we understand this perfectly well elsewhere. A plumber can install a radiator with extraordinary precision and care, and we don't immediately start talking about sculpture. Introduce a camera, however, preferably one with a reassuringly large lens, and the distinction seems to evaporate. Buttons, it turns out, feel democratic. The problem is that art isn't just something expressive, or something visual, or something that took effort. If that were enough, a well-plated lunch would count, a polished sales deck would count, and every filtered selfie would require a curator's note. Art needs more than execution. It needs a relationship to meaning, to history, to form, to culture. It has to sit somewhere, it has to push against something. It has to enter a conversation, it doesn't just exist. It positions itself. It doesn't merely post, it argues. And this is where a great deal of contemporary image making quietly falls apart. It produces the look of art without taking on any of the burden. Mood instead of meaning. Aesthetic effect instead of formal risk. Self-expression instead of an actual language. People feel deeply about their photographs. Of course they do, they feel deeply about their lunch as well. Feeling, on its own, is not a rare material. The language problem. There's also a particular dialect doing the rounds in photography circles, and it's doing an extraordinary amount of work. In this dialect, nobody takes pictures anymore, they capture. Subjects are never chosen. They are things one is drawn to, often with a slightly mystical air, as if the photographer had been summoned by a particularly photogenic staircase. There is, inevitably, a fascination with liminal spaces, which turns out to mean doorways, corridors and car parks at dusk. These places are considered meaningful precisely because nobody ever has to explain why. Light is no longer a condition, it's a relationship. The work is always a journey. Though rather like certain infrastructure projects, it has no clear destination and appears never to have been properly planned. Authentic tends to mean slightly underexposed and featuring someone looking away from the camera, as though avoiding both eye contact and accountability. None of this is art, it's theatre. It's the performance of seriousness in advance of the work itself being examined. The language steps in early and hopes nobody looks too closely at what is, more often than not, a perfectly decent photograph of a door in Lisbon. The problem is not trivial, as language shapes perception. If you fill a culture with the vocabulary of creativity without the substance behind it, and you make it harder to recognise the real thing when it arrives, if everything is a journey, nobody is actually going anywhere. The equipment displacement? Then there's the gear conversation, which has become a kind of elaborate avoidance strategy. For a certain type of photographer, everything reduces to equipment, sensor size, glass quality, dynamic range, the spiritual authority of film, the moral character of competing brands. The unspoken belief is that with the right setup, art will follow naturally, like a well-behaved conclusion, but it won't. The camera is not the artist. At best, it's a very expensive pencil, and nobody seriously believes that buying a better pencil will produce better literature. To me, the photographers most preoccupied with equipment tend to produce the least interesting work because all their energy is going into preparation rather than practice. It's a way of circling the idea of making something without ever quite committing to it. They're not photographers so much as collectors who occasionally go outside. Why some work matters, and most of it doesn't. This is why certain photographers matter, and most of their imitators do not. Plenty of people can photograph mountains beautifully. The light is dramatic, the scale does half the work, and modern cameras are very forgiving. But occasionally someone does something more than that. They don't just record the landscape, they interpret it. The image has structure, intention, a sense that it is thinking rather than merely showing. Most of what follows, however technically accomplished, simply confirms what we already know. For example, mountains are large, they are atmospheric, and they look good at sunset. Thank you for that. The sublime becomes a mood board and nature becomes content. Classical music is suffering the same way. Even Radio 3 now packages it up in playlists under mood descriptors, and so it becomes a lifestyle soundtrack, not a medium or form in its own right. The same pattern appears elsewhere. In photography, work that looks bold or ironic often turns out on closer inspection to be little more than mild cruelty directed at strangers. It takes intelligence to turn observation into insight. Without that, irony collapses into contempt with a camera, and we've produced quite a lot of that. The line such as it is, so where's the line? Well, I'd say that roughly speaking, art doesn't just represent, it intervenes. It changes how something is seen, or what can be seen at all. It shifts perceptions slightly and makes the familiar strange, or the strange legible. Most photography, even very polished photography, doesn't do this. It confirms, flatters and reassures. It tells us the world is beautiful, cinematic, poignant, edgy, all of which we already suspected. There's nothing wrong with that, but it isn't a contribution to culture so much as a tribute to it. Which is why, yes, many people calling themselves artists aren't. They've adopted the identity without taking on the demands, and they mistake impulse for originality and confidence for significance. A teenager can absolutely make art. Age is irrelevant in that context, but the work still has to do something. If it doesn't wrestle with form, engage with a tradition, or produce any meaning beyond, I felt something and here it is, then the claim remains thin. Emotion is common, add a decent lens and you still just have emotion. The problem with kindness. Part of the issue is that we've become slightly allergic to judgment. Judgment implies hierarchy, and hierarchy feels impolite, so instead we've built a culture of encouragement. Everything is stunning, powerful, breathtaking, including on occasion a pigeon on a post. The person told their pigeon is breathtaking will, quite reasonably, produce another pigeon. That pigeon will also be breathtaking. Before long, we have a thriving ecosystem of breathtaking pigeons, and no particular sense of progress. Encouragement is kind, but it isn't the same thing as seriousness. A culture that refuses to discriminate doesn't become generous, it becomes vague, and vagueness is not especially helpful when you're trying to work out why one piece of work matters, and another quietly disappears into the scroll. They've cancelled art. There is, however, a further consequence, and it's not a small one. If everything is art, then nothing is. And once that happens, the entire vocabulary we use to talk about art, good and bad, ambitious and lazy, original and derivative, collapses along with it. This is not just a semantic inconvenience. It's a slow-motion cultural failure conducted with enormous politeness. If the photograph of the door in Lisbon is art, and genuinely significant work is also art, then good art and bad art become distinctions without much force. The category is now so broad it exerts no pressure on anything inside it. Simply saying something is good art becomes roughly as useful as saying it is a good object, technically correct maybe, but practically meaningless. The language that once allowed people to argue about art has been quietly repurposed into the language of validation. Everything is affirmed, nothing is evaluated, and in that shift, the words themselves lose their function. This matters beyond photography. Once you decide that judgment is a form of aggression, you haven't liberated culture, you've disarmed it. The same logic that protects the mediocre photograph protects the mediocre novel, the mediocre film, the mediocre play. Standards aren't lowered, they're removed entirely and replaced with feelings, which, as previously noted, are extremely common. What's particularly impressive is how gently this has been achieved. Art hasn't been attacked. It's been expanded until it's suffocated. No manifesto required, just a steady, well-meaning stretching of the category until there's nothing left to be inside or outside of. A thing that means everything means nothing, and a word that applies to everyone protects no one. They've cancelled art by celebrating it. What fills the gap? The room doesn't stay empty. First, the market moves in. If criticism can't do its job, price takes over as the only legible signal of value. Galleries explain why their own artists matter, which is convenient. The distinction between criticism and marketing quietly dissolves. When nobody quite knows whose judgment to trust, cost becomes the proxy. Secondly, the algorithm moves in. It cannot recognise quality, only engagement, which is not the same thing and is often the opposite. Work is rewarded for being immediately legible, quickly affecting, instantly shareable. In many ways, depth becomes a liability, difficulty becomes invisible, and the result is predictable. Work drifts toward what performs, not necessarily what matters, but what travels. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, vibes move in. Work is no longer argued for, it is surrounded by atmosphere. It explores, it interrogates, and it invites. One is never quite told what, or how, or why. The language expands to compensate for the absence of anything precise, and so you end up with a culture that is highly expressive and curiously inarticulate at the same time. The real offence. All of this sounds a bit harsh, and it's meant to. The idea that everyone is an artist feels inclusive, but it comes at a cost. It erases the difference between casual expression and the far more difficult business of making something that actually alters how we see. That isn't kindness, it's a kind of polite philistinism. Most photographers are doing something else entirely. Documenting, styling, remembering, selling, presenting themselves. Some do that brilliantly, it deserves respect, and they should be celebrated. Just not the inflated, slightly frantic praise that gets thrown around, like confetti at a wedding that's gone on too long. Art is narrower than that, harder and less evenly distributed. It isn't a compliment, it isn't a participation trophy, it's an achievement. And if we can't say that plainly anymore, then the problem isn't with art, it's with us. And no amount of good light, authentic feeling, or late night wandering through liminal spaces is going to fix it.